We will soon be saying goodbye to Mistweaver's first meta season of Mythic Plus. This was actually a surprising meta, and it took a little bit of time for it to develop. Overall, Mistweaver is one of the lowest represented healers across all seasons of Mythic Plus, usually the lowest or second lowest played and represented within the title range. Prior to Midnight Season 1, our most competitive season was Dragonflight Season 3, where we actually had the highest representation of healers among the 0.1%, but we were still third best for the actual highest keys being done, following behind Resto Druid and no healer comps. Almost all of these no healer runs were Resto Druid specking into Boomkin for the first pull or the first portion of the dungeon, depending on which map we were playing. So if you want to, you can add that 48 to the 99 in Druid and you can see that we're still second to them, but being third to no healer is a different kind of hurt. So with Midnight Season 1 being the first true meta, what changed? Let's rewind and take a look at where it all started back in Midnight Beta. Like many specs, Mistweaver got some pretty significant changes coming from the War Within into Midnight. This is when a lot of abilities were pruned, and Mistweaver was no exception. We lost some of our active abilities like Jadefire Stomp, Diffuse Magic, as well as our Kick. One of our hero talents was reworked, and at the time in War Within, it was the favored hero talent for keys, and it is no longer usable after the rework. Nearly all of our heal amps were removed, and we also got some major reworks on really iconic Mistweaver abilities like Chi-Chi, Manatee, Shaylin's Gift replacing Vivify, and Ancient Teachings being always active. A major change early on for Vivify as well is that it was uncapped. Overall, a lot of the changes that we got in early beta were excellent for quality of life and simplicity of the spec. We had accumulated a lot of buffs and interactions kind of under the hood that made Mistweaver really complicated and difficult to get into unless you'd been keeping up with a spec for a while, and even then, it was really overwhelming. But outside of that, early beta Mistweaver was just okay. It didn't have a great performance in the War Within Mythic Plus, and it wasn't too different in terms of power. We hadn't had ray testing yet, so it wasn't standing out by any means. We had a lot of bugs, but that's a given, considering it is both beta and Mistweaver, so this wasn't surprising or overly concerning at this point. We were pretty happy with the early changes, but we were eager to see what else was coming for us. Cutting forward to the first set of raid testing and Mythic Plus testing, this was our first chance to actually see the changes in action and how it shaped up against other healers, and it was bad. Our raid numbers were low across the board, and we put in a ton of effort to apply, maintain, and extend our renewing mist, only for the prep to be pretty useless when it came to press Vivify. It just didn't do enough, and all of our spells cost way too much for the throughput that they provided. With the mana cost reduction removed from Manatee, our Yulon windows and high count Vivify windows became giant mana sinks for very little reward compared to the cost. I remember looking at the log spreadsheet, and all of the Mistweaver logs that were moderately competitive were actually bug abusing and embellishment, which gave them something crazy like an extra 12,000 main stat or something, and we were still losing to discipline and pretty mid-pack compared to other healers. This first set of raid testing was really dire. We also started to see some major bugs pop up around this time. In Raid, there were often times where Heart of the Jade Serpent was not proccing, Unity Within wouldn't proc, Manatee would stop generating stacks, and Rising Mist would stop extending our HOTS. In Keys, we saw even more bugs, and far more impactful ones, like Jadefire Teachings and Way of the Crane turning off and no longer functioning, Tranquil Tea stopped generating stacks of Shaylin's Gift, Master of Harmony stopped working entirely, Morning Breeze stopped resetting the cooldown on Rising Sunkick, Jadefire Stomp was not transferring healing through Ancient Teachings, in addition to all of the bugs that we saw in Raid as well. Also at this point, Mistweaver had not received the 20% healer damage buff that all of the other healers had during the first week of beta, and while healer damage is a hot topic in terms of relevance, the damage is relevant for Mistweaver because such a large portion of our healing does come directly from our damage. Mistweaver had Jadefire Teachings transfer rate nerfed in the expectation that we would get the compensatory buff, and it just got left out. These things made Mistweaver virtually unplayable for a lot of the testing, particularly in Keys. These were things that dictated entire talent builds and playstyles, and they would just randomly stop working in instance content, and we had absolutely no idea what was causing it. As a result, we did see a lot of different builds come out of beta, primarily the Yulon and Tear of Morning stuff that we saw in the highest beta keys for Mistweaver, and honestly, we were worried that this is actually what we were going to get for keys. It was more of a raid build than a key build, and in reality, I do think that this ended up doing as well as it did because the talents turning off for this build were not as impactful or noticeable compared to what ended up being the meta build on live. This bug we had not seen during pre-patch, we never saw it on live, so we just chalked it up to it being some weird beta stuff, and tried focusing on the things that we could play with and just hoped that it would be fixed before live. After the final set of testing, we were not happy with the performance of the spec. We had some eyes on the Shaylin's gift build, but it honestly just didn't make sense that they would want us taking that in raid, especially considering they split the button between Shaylin's gift and Vivify so deliberately, in addition to uncapping Vivify, but tuning said otherwise. We also got additional notes that didn't have a chance to be tested in a raid setting. The mana cost of Enveloping Mist was nerfed by about 1%, and they reduced the Rushing Wind Kick mana cost by half, in addition to Mana Tea getting buffed by 12.5% and then an additional 20% later on in pre-patch. But there wasn't much to do this late in beta. Our talents were still shutting off, raid testing was over, and pre-patch with the old raid didn't give us anything real to work with. It had been nerfed so much, and it was as late in farm as you could get while still using old tier sets, so it wasn't really good information. Now, Midnight has launched and Heroic Week is here. This is where things started to take a turn for Mistweaver. A lot of the issues that we had in beta, in terms of missing interactions and mana problems, had been solved, our damage buff was addressed, our raid healing had been buffed through Shaylin's Gift's base buff and cloud nerfs, in addition to Vivify Cleave being buffed, but the big one was Way of the Crane. Before and during beta, Way of the Crane healed for 125% of the damage done to 3 allies per tick, but when Heroic Week began, Way of the Crane was reworked to heal for 340% of the damage onto 1 ally per tick. So things were really looking up for us at this point. Most, if not all of our concerns during beta were fixed, our bug had gone away, raid was going well, and keys seemed like they'd be pretty chill with the Way of the Crane changes. All of that, and other healers all got some pretty substantial aura nerfs, bringing everything a bit more in line. A lot of the biggest changes happened after raid testing, so we didn't even get to see these changes and how they impacted us for a while. These late changes are also part of what enabled us to perform so well this season. And now Mythic Week is here. We have gear from Heroic Week, keys are open, and about 9 hours after servers come up, we get a message in the Monk Discord. And then another, and another, and another, and we had to accept the fact that the bug that made beta so unplayable made it live, and we still had no idea why 6 months after we first saw it. We went through logs trying to figure out what it was, this time with a larger sample size and some fresh eyes. What would we have on beta and live, but only after Mythic Week had begun? Was it Mythic Plus? Was it Mythic Raid? Was it some combination of talents, and why did it only show up in instances? Then we got essentially what was our holy grail log. Swirl had found one log from the night before, where everything worked properly, and then from the same person a second log after reset where their Rising Mist stopped working during their raid progression. The only difference in their log was the fact that they had acquired their 4-piece by the time that they logged the second time. We went to look at the other ones and confirmed that everyone with an issue had their 4-piece, and it checked out on being an issue on beta since there is a tier vendor, so everybody had it. We instructed everyone to not wear their 4-piece until it was fixed, and it seemed to be more consistently bugging in keys than in raid, but generally if you were in keys or progging a boss, we told people to take it off until it was fixed. This lasted for about a week, which is pretty fast once it was actually figured out. There are some lingering issues that aren't tied to the 4-piece, but these can usually be fixed with relogging and are generally only present in raid. We're still not too sure about those. So now, for the first time in Midnight and about halfway through Mythic Week, we can actually get a good idea of how Mistweaver is supposed to be performing. And it's certainly not bad. We had good representation in the Race the World first, partially due to the mass dispel on Paladins and partially due to our throughput. We also had a few different builds that could be played based on fight requirements, like Lura or Paladin healing the crystals or healing the heal absorb. Keys, on the other hand, were a little bit up in the air. Early on, it looked like Resto Druid and Brewmaster were going to be the meta healer and tank. Mistweaver and Brew wasn't a bad combination, but class stacking doesn't happen too often in keys, and in this case you would have been missing out on Mark of the Wild, which is pretty bad. But then they nerfed Brewmaster, and Bear got a raid nerf, which ended up being a Mythic Plus buff. This swapped Brew and Bear for the meta tank for keys, which opened up the door for Mistweaver to replace Resto Druid and avoid class stacking without missing out on Mark of the Wild. On top of this, Mistweaver has extremely efficient healing through damage conversion, our mana pool is excellent, and our damage is high without sacrificing healing. Dungeon design had also changed quite a bit from Dragonflight and the War Within, Where previously one-shots were common, Mistweaver had no real tools to prevent this on enough people or frequent enough to really stand a chance at being competitive. Midnight's dungeon design, on the other hand, was more focused on throughput versus surviving a one-shot, and this really was our ticket in. Generally, Mistweaver always had good healing throughput, sometimes even the best in a season, but the dungeons just didn't require it. Shadowlands, for example, Mistweaver had excellent throughput, but we didn't do enough damage for the tuning in that expansion. Or Dragonflight Season 1, Mistweaver was pretty good until you reached one-shot territory, in which Mistweaver was actually the first to die because it was before our defensive buff. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that go into whatever ends up making the meta. It depends on the DPS specs that are good, whatever tank spec is the best, the dungeon design, the dungeon tuning, and it all just came together for us this season. Now, mid-season, things have solidified a bit. Mistweaver actually became more meta as time progressed. The DPS specs loved having additional mobs on the bosses for funnel, and Mistweaver could use these to funnel healing. You were even pulling mobs around your Mistweaver to try to help them utilize Way of the Crane in situations where typically it'd be single target, and Mistweaver can struggle at that. Litany being a trinket that healers and your Augurvoker use covers the gap in effective HP tools to combat the few one-shots that exist this season. Mistweaver also has great utility. We have CCs, knocks, stuns, slows, our Dispel and Mass Dispel, as well of course our damage. We received a little bit of tuning here and there on Shaylons and on some bug fixes, and a bigger one mid-season that kind of caught us by surprise was that Soothing Mist was allowed baseline to be used while moving. Previously, this was tied to Way of the Serpent, which is a choice node with Way of the Crane, and after the last Way of the Crane buff where they changed it to 1 ally instead of 3, Way of the Serpent was off the table. You were never running that. And now, late in Season 1, people are tired of Mistweaver and want it gone, which is pretty on brand for the WoW community. I would just like to remind them that some of us waited 8 years for this, so they can suck it up for a few months.